At the site of the Dachau concentration camp near Munich, Germany, there is a museum containing relics from the camp, as well as very grim photos depicting the years of the war. There is a sign next to the exit that reads, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Now, in that context, it's sort of hard to believe that anything as horrible as German death camps could ever take place again. But the truth is, mass genocide does continue in various parts of the world, underscoring the truth that if we don't learn from the past, we will repeat it again. And it happens that way in every generation. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul gives the same message to the church at Corinth. Now, the first verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 are often ignored and overlooked because verse 13 is so critical and so important. So many people have memorized verse 13 and used it in their Christian life that they just sort of skip quickly through the first 12 verses to get to verse 13, which says, "The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so you can endure." So, such a powerful verse that there's a tendency to skip over the verses preceding it. And we're going to get to that verse next week, but we're not going to skip over the other verses because they are very important, and particularly as it relates to this saying, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So we'll read the first 5 verses first. "I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses. All of them ate the same spiritual food, and all of them drank the same spiritual water. For they drank from the spiritual rock that traveled with them, and that rock was Christ. Yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." Now, that is a setup for warning the Christians in the church at Corinth just exactly what was about to befall them. Paul moved from the discussion of discipline and training at the end of chapter 9, where we finished last week, to a history lesson, because he recognized that one of the greatest hindrances to spiritual growth is the feeling of complacency that says, "We're all right. Everything's good for now." And he wants the church to see that the solid ground we often believe we are standing on could in fact be quicksand. Now, the key verse, or the key word in these verses, I think is in verse 1, where it says, "All of them were guided by a cloud." All right, they left the wilderness. They left Egypt. They were in the wilderness. All of them were guided by a cloud. All of them walked through the sea on dry ground. All of them were baptized from the same spiritual baptism. All of them. Everybody had the same experience, so there shouldn't be any difference in them in terms of how they've been blessed, how they've been treated. And he pointed out that everyone that was in that group who left Egypt with Moses personally experienced the greatness of God. Think about what all these people in this history lesson saw. They saw the 10 plagues on Egypt. You know, I think if I'd seen that, I would like to think that later on I would be like Joshua and Caleb and not like all the rest of them. They saw the 10 plagues fall on the Egyptians. They witnessed the parting of the Red Sea. They walked across on dry land with water on either side of them. They all followed the cloud that led them by day and the pillar of fire that led them by night. They all gathered manna in the morning to eat. They saw God provide water from a rock. All of them did. They saw the smoke and the lightning and heard the thunder and felt the rumble of the earth in the earthquake. They all saw this. And Paul said these people all had the same spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Rock was a common description of God. So Paul is saying here that the blessings these people witnessed were typical of those which come from God. As you read the story in Exodus through Deuteronomy, you see these people who have been so blessed rebelling against God over and over and over again. In the book of Numbers, we see the pinnacle event of them rebelling, where Moses sends 12 spies into the promised land. And 10 come back saying, we can't do it. We're not capable of overcoming these people. And 2, Joshua and Caleb say, we are well capable of doing it. So as a result of the lack of true faith, all the adults in the group who had witnessed God working in such astounding ways died in the wilderness, and only Joshua and Caleb were sustained and allowed to live and ultimately to see the promised land. The lesson we are supposed to learn from this, as the sign on Dachau said, is we must not put our confidence in our experiences. We got to keep on building those experiences as we continue to grow in our discipleship. It's all too often that Christians have a conversion experience. I see it all the time. They feel led by God to be searchers for the truth. They obey the gospel. They repent of their sins. They're buried with Christ in baptism. They join a small group or a study group. They serve in a ministry. And then slowly but surely, they become complacent. We're like people who are climbing a mountain, and partway up the mountain, we stop and enjoy the view and decide that the view there is so good we don't need to go on any further. And that's what was happening with the church at Corinth. And so Paul is warning them. We pick up in verse 6. These things happened as a warning to us, so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. As the scriptures say, the people celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. And we must not engage in sexual immorality, as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day. This is sticking on me quite a bit today. Nor should we put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and then died from snake bites. And don't grumble as some of them did, and then were destroyed by the angel of death. So Paul looks at the history of Israel's sins: coveting, idolatry, immorality, testing God, grumbling, and tells us we should learn from their example. We need to see how these people who had been so richly blessed by God had drifted away from God, so that we can guard ourselves from doing the same thing. It is amazing to think that people who actually watched water in the Nile River turn into blood would soon fall away from God. It is amazing to watch that people who saw frogs everywhere as a sign of Pharaoh's God's dissatisfaction with Pharaoh would suddenly fall away from God. It's amazing. But it's also amazing how we sometimes see the miracles and the blessings of God, and we still slip up. We're inclined to focus only on what we're supposed to do. If we do those things, we feel like we've achieved our goal. Let me illustrate what I mean. We may feel pretty good about ourselves, about not drugging or drinking to excess, but that doesn't mean we're taking care of our body. We may feel pretty good about the fact that we don't take God's name in vain, but that doesn't mean that we are honoring the Lord. Just because we're not doing something doesn't mean we're doing what He wanted us to do. We may never actually murder another person, but that doesn't mean that we respect, appreciate, and support life. We may rarely miss church, but that doesn't mean we're honoring the concept of worshiping God. So how do we get to that? Paul says in this passage in verse 6, first of all, he says, learn to desire what is good for you. These things happened as a warning to us so that we would not crave evil things as they did. Paul said these people set their hearts on what was evil. The positive side of that is we must set our hearts and our minds and our thoughts on what is good. As Philippians 4:8 says, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy. Think about these things. And to do that, we have to be able to monitor our thinking. We need to consciously feed our mind with things that are good. You know, advertisers have learned that if they can put something in front of you in a desirable manner for long enough and keep it in your mind, you will eventually buy it. You'll eventually be sucked in. They're very, very good at it. Well, Paul is saying the same thing about the spiritual mind. If you can keep these things in your mind long enough, you will eventually buy into the good this will do in your life. But to do that takes conscious thinking. And if you want to do that, if you want to desire what's good, you have to turn away from feelings of bitterness and focus on thoughts about mercy and grace and forgiveness. Instead of spending all day watching the news and feeling the anxiety and despair that comes with the news, take some of that time and fill it with the Word of God. I talked to somebody just a couple of weeks ago that said, I have got to go on a sabbatical from the news. I have to. I found myself, it was on all the time in the background in the house, and I found myself so discouraged and downhearted and even angry that I decided I'm going to take a sabbatical from the news. And I promised myself I would not watch or listen to any news for a week. And it was the best week I've had this year, she said. And I can vouch for that. I can understand that. It's a constant challenge. The Israelites were guilty of idolatry, this text says. Now, we think of idolatry as bowing down before some foreign idol or maybe even following some earthly teacher. But idolatry is simply any time we allow something else to have more influence on our life than God does. It could be our money. It could be our job. It could be our family. It could be our pleasure and amusements. It could be our politics. Our challenge is to seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and then all the other things will be added in. It's really helpful to constantly ask ourselves the question of about 20 years ago or so. Remember those? That's a bit too many, 6 on one arm. But what would Jesus do? It really is a good thing to ask ourselves from time to time. Maybe even better would be, what did Jesus do? Because sometimes we're speculating about what Jesus would do. We got our hands full just doing what Jesus did, don't we? And then it helps to add to that question, what advice does God's Word give? Well, it tells us, for instance, to develop wholesome and pure relationships. Verse 8 says the Israelites were sexually permissive. They sold out to the pleasure-driven values of the society around them. That is so easy to do. And it's probably easier for us than it has been at any time in history since that day. We have constantly been bombarded by sexual images, by sensual images and lifestyles. And we've got to stop seeing people as physical forms to exploit rather than human beings to love. You want to know what the problem with pornography is? It is just that, which is the Greek word porneia in the New Testament. It is just that, which means fornication or sexual immorality. The problem is, it is taking a living spirit and soul created in the image of God, and it is exploiting the person as if they are an animal, as if they don't matter. And it's a sad thing to treat people that way, as people to exploit rather than people to love. We need to start asking, how can I enrich this person instead of, what can this person do for me? Learning to respect others. And then he said in verse 10 something about grumbling. We got to learn to not grumble. And don't grumble as some of them did, and then were destroyed by the angel of death. It's very easy for us to naturally fall into that pattern of grumbling. Things are hard, so we look for somebody to blame. We pout. We look for somebody we can gripe to. One of my favorite people in churches in the United States 20 or 30 years ago was a man by the name of Ed Dobson. He was highly influential, probably second in command in what was called the moral majority back in the 80s and the 90s. And he was a very talented preacher, very talented writer, and he got ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. But instead of griping or complaining, he used all of that time as his body just slowly but surely ceased to function. He used all that time to make videos and seminars and write a book called Prayers and Promises when facing a life-threatening illness. And in the course of that book, he wrote these words: "It is easy to believe that God will take care of you when you don't need to be taken care of. But when you desperately need the care of God for the ultimate issues of life, it's not so easy to think that. And it's not so easy to stop worrying." I think he's right, don't you? I mean, it's easy for us when we are healthy and things are going well. It's easy to think that God will take care of you. But when you can't move a limb on your body, when you can't perform daily functions in a bathroom, someone else has to do it for you. That becomes a bit of a cliche, doesn't it? And that's when you find out truly how much faith you have. So in these first 10 verses of 1 Corinthians, Paul is saying in difficult times, instead of testing God and grumbling against God, being upset with God, we need to trust God. Our challenge is to learn to trust God's character more than we trust our circumstances. And to do that, we just sometimes need to repeat God's promises, prayers and promises. We need to repeat God's prayers and promises until we actually believe them. I think it was about 3 weeks ago today that I told you in the service about a friend of mine that I grew up with. We were in the same youth group. He's been preaching at his church in Smyrna, Tennessee, about as long as I've been here, 30-something years. His dad was a preacher. His brother's a preacher. His name is Wayne Cornwell. And he has been diagnosed with a malignant tumor in his eye. And he is about to undergo next week treatment that just sounds awful to me. They're going to go in and they think it could have spread to his pancreas and liver and other parts of his body, but they got to deal with the eye immediately or he may lose it. So they're going to go in and they're going to put this big piece of metal in his eye, hoping to radiate part of that eye and leave it there for 3 days, and nobody can get within 6 feet of him in the hospital for 3 days. And then they're going to take it out. And then he'll be biopsied for the pancreas and liver and other places because it's a very aggressive form of cancer. So I called him. Hadn't talked to him in a long time. I called him about 2 weeks ago. And I said, "How are you handling it? How are you holding up?" "I'm great. Look, the worst thing that can happen here is I'm going to die and go to heaven." "How bad would that be?" He said, "I'm actually looking forward to it. I'm either going to get better or I'm going to die and go to heaven. That is a win-win." I said, "Brother, you keep thinking like that. I'm going to pray that you're able to keep thinking like that. I'm going to pray that that kind of attitude takes you all the way through." That's exactly what we're talking about here. Our challenge is to learn to trust God's character more than we trust our circumstances. Verse 10 talked about grumbling. You know what grumbling really is? It's dissatisfaction with God. Think about who these people were who were grumbling. These were people that had seen miracle after miracle after miracle of God. These are people that had been delivered from Egyptian bondage by Moses and by God, and then had been walked across a dry Red Sea, and then had been taken care of morning and night with manna and quail. These are people who had been led by a ball of fire at night. These were people who were being miraculously taken care of, and still they were grumbling. They were grumbling. And it's a sin that God clearly doesn't take lightly. Because if you think of it this way, when God's people question or complain, they're questioning and complaining about Him. They're challenging His wisdom, His grace, His goodness, His love. So our need for contentment is not only for our own well-being, we do need that, but it's also to trust and honor God. Have you ever noticed that a person who is a grumbler is like the flu virus during the wintertime? They're highly contagious. They make just about everybody around them sick. They have the uncanny ability to suck the joy out of just about any circumstance. They act like all of life is trying to rip them off. They never seem happy. That's these people in this text, according to verse 10. On the flip side, have you ever noticed how someone who is grateful and contented is like sunshine after the rain? They are full of life, full of zest, or you could compare it this way. People who grumble all the time, you see them coming at you and you want to just hide. People who are contented all the time, you see them coming at you and you want to just run toward them. That's because gratitude is the ability to experience life as a gift. And it liberates us from the prison of self-preoccupation. Now he gives a final warning in verses 11 and 12 in our text. These things happen to them as examples for us. Those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. If you think you are standing strong, be careful not to fall. This passage has a cousin. It's over in Romans 15:4, which says, such things were written in the scriptures long ago to teach us. The reason we read these stories and know these examples is they're determined to teach us, to give us hope and encouragement as we wait patiently for God's promises to be fulfilled. That's the point of them. So let me give you this morning some final lessons we should be learning from the Israelites in these first 12 verses. To learn from the past, we need to study the past. Obviously, if the records of people in the Bible were written to teach us, as Romans 15:4 says, so that we would later learn from their example, it follows that we should read our Bibles. I know it's hard to read the Bible sometimes. Sometimes we feel like we're just reading dry historical records. I've pretty well quit having us do the one-year Bible all the way through. Last year, at the beginning of the year before COVID, I thought, I want people in the Bible every day, but I decided we're going to do it different this year. We're going to do just the New Testament. Because I know what happens when we do the daily Bible reading plan. Genesis is exciting, full of great stories. Exodus, a little less exciting than Leviticus. And not exciting at all. And people get over in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and they go, I'll catch up later. By later, they mean in heaven. And so I know it's hard sometimes to read our Bibles, but instead of simply trying to master the facts of Old Testament stories, it's important that we ask, what is God trying to teach me in this account? It takes some work, but it's worth the effort. What is God saying? What is He trying to teach me? Because in order to learn from the past, like 1 Corinthians 10:12 and Romans 15:4 says, we have to truly study the past. Second lesson I get out of this. The sins of others can happen to us if we let our guard down. I love the way Eugene Peterson paraphrases 1 Corinthians 10:10 through 12 in the Message. These are all warning markers. Danger! In our history books, written down so that we don't repeat their mistakes. Our positions in the story are parallel. They are at the beginning, we are at the end. And we are just as capable of messing it up as they were. So don't be naive and self-confident. You're not exempt. You could fall flat on your face as easily as anyone else. Forget about self-confidence. It's useless. Cultivate God confidence. I love that. We have to recognize our own vulnerability to sin. And we too can drift away from God. In the right circumstances, we could be unfaithful to our spouse. We could commit a criminal act. We could lose control in our anger. We could become an idolater. In the right circumstances, whenever anybody has said to me, I just don't understand that sin, how anybody could commit that sin, all I can do is think of these passages and think, be careful, those who are standing better take heed lest they fall. And I also think that too often we look at people who fall into these sins with an air of disbelief and disgust. Shame on us. Under the right circumstances, we could be that. But what is it about you or me that thinks we couldn't be David, a man after God's own heart, in the wrong circumstance at the wrong time, committing adultery, or covering it up later? What is it about you? What is it about me that makes us think we couldn't be Moses and become angry in a moment's time, and so angry we strike a rock rather than speak at a rock? What is it that makes us think, you and me, though we've never spent 3 years with Jesus, that we couldn't be like Peter and put in the pressure of the moment, in the right circumstance? Maybe our boss, our employer is standing around, or maybe some lawmakers who've made laws, and we deny Christ. And we don't really mean it in our heart of hearts, but it's what comes out of us to save our skin at the time. I think all of those things and more is exactly what this text is speaking of. But I want to say this in conclusion, because I think this is vitally important. As significant as past experiences are, they are past. They are past. All around the country, we erect monuments to remind us of significant events from the past. Some are monuments of success, some are monuments of failure. The ones from failure, we learn more from than the ones of success. As you walk through a cemetery, you'll see monuments of people who have touched our lives. Some for the good, some from the bad. Remembering the past is good. It's valuable. It's appropriate as long as we remember it is the past. So here's how I want you to look at 1 Corinthians 10 before we get to this monumental verse next week in verse 13 that is so important to all of us. I want you to look at the first 12 verses that we've studied this morning as continuing education. You know, most jobs require some kind of continuing education. And the reason for that is employers know that if you aren't continuing to learn and grow, you're stagnating and falling behind. It's the same way in your spiritual life. If you're living just on your past experiences in your spiritual life and you don't have any current spiritual stories to tell, then you're stagnating and drifting slowly away from God. Some employers will send you to a conference room where a speaker passes on what he or she has learned and gives you information and guidelines that will help you be more successful in your business. And the best speakers will give lots of illustrations to show what happens if you do or don't follow the guidelines. Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is designed to be like continuing education for all of us. Paul is giving us valuable guidelines and illustrating those guidelines through the history of Israel. Like any good conference, if you take the information that he gives you here and apply it in your life, you can avoid some very painful pitfalls. You will grow in your competency. But if you don't learn the past, you will grow in your complacency. If the information merely gathers in a notebook or a notebook of your mind and is never put into practice, you will become another example of what happens when you refuse to learn from the past. So we began this morning with that haunting, chilling sign over the Dachau concentration camp in Munich, Germany. Those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat its mistakes. May we as God's people learn from history.